Make the rejected Omega sing. Someone laughed. At least let the feast have one last joke before the moon crown chooses its queen. The laughter rolled across the Blackthorn Palace ballroom like a cold wind, echoing beneath towering stone arches draped in black velvet and silver banners embroidered with the royal wolf crest. Hundreds of nobles from every northern pack filled the grand hall in shimmering gowns and tailored ceremonial coats, each hoping to witness the Alpha King finally choose a Luna after years of ruling alone. Crystal chandeliers reflected pale moonlight pouring through stained glass windows, while rows of silver candles flickered with an eerie calm, their flames barely moving despite the draft that slipped through the ancient castle walls. At the very edge of the celebration stood Emily Carter, her plain ivory dress already stained from spilled wine she had quietly cleaned from another guest's table only moments before. She kept her head lowered, hoping the marble floor might somehow swallow her whole. 3 weeks had passed since Derek Hale had rejected her before their entire pack, declaring she was too weak to stand beside any alpha worthy of respect. Since then, whispers followed her everywhere she walked. Broken Omega, moon forgotten, unwanted. Tonight was supposed to be simple. She had come only as part of the serving staff, carrying silver trays between smiling nobles who barely noticed she existed. She never expected Madison Vale to notice her. Madison lifted a crystal glass with effortless elegance, her golden gown sparkling beneath the chandeliers. "Your Majesty," she said sweetly toward the raised royal platform. "Every moon crown ceremony deserves entertainment. Why not let our rejected Omega honor the moon goddess by singing the Luna hymn?" More laughter erupted around the room. Emily's fingers tightened around the silver tray until they trembled. The Luna hymn was sacred. It had been sung only by queens, royal priestesses, and women chosen by destiny itself. Asking an unwanted Omega to perform, it was not an invitation. It was humiliation disguised as amusement. Derek folded his arms with a satisfied smile. "Come now, Emily," called loudly enough for half the ballroom to hear. "Surely your voice is worth more than your wolf." Even servants nearby lowered their eyes, embarrassed for her. Emily swallowed against the knot tightening inside her throat. She could walk away. She could disappear into the kitchens and let another servant replace her before anyone stopped caring. That had always been the safest choice. Stay quiet. Stay invisible. Survive another day. But then, without warning, another memory surfaced. A tiny wooden cabin tucked beside a snow-covered forest. A warm fireplace. Her mother's gentle hands brushing chestnut hair away from her face as soft music filled the room. The Luna hymn isn't about power, her mother had whispered years ago. It's about kindness strong enough to guide those who have forgotten the light. Emily had been only 8 years old then. She remembered every note, every word, every quiet smile. Her mother had never finished explaining why their family alone still remembered the forgotten verses. She had simply kissed Emily's forehead and promised, "One day your voice will matter more than anyone believes." Emily slowly placed the silver tray onto a nearby table. Her breathing steadied. Her shaking hands relaxed. The ballroom continued buzzing with smug anticipation, convinced another spectacle was about to begin. None of them noticed that, high above the royal throne carved from black stone, King Alexander Blackthorn had quietly lifted his eyes from the council gathered beside him. His expression remained unreadable, calm as winter itself, but something deep inside him stirred before a single note had even been sung. Silence settled over the ballroom one heartbeat at a time as Emily stepped away from the servants' table and walked toward the open space beneath the towering crystal chandeliers. Every footstep echoed across the polished black marble floor, making her feel as though the entire kingdom could hear the uncertainty inside her heart. Noble families exchanged amused glances behind jeweled fans, expecting hesitation, tears, or embarrassment. Madison smiled with quiet satisfaction, convinced the forgotten Omega would crumble before reaching the center of the hall. Derek leaned casually against a carved stone pillar, wearing the confident expression of someone certain the evening would only reinforce everything he had ever said about the woman he had rejected. Emily stopped beneath the pale moonlight streaming through the stained glass ceiling and slowly lifted her eyes. Beyond the rows of elegant guests, she could see the ancient silver statue of the moon goddess standing behind the royal throne, its face illuminated by soft light that seemed almost alive. For a brief moment, every cruel whisper faded away. She remembered the small cabin where her mother had taught her the sacred melody during long winter evenings while snow drifted outside the windows. Her mother had never treated the hymn as a performance. She had treated it as a prayer filled with hope for hearts carrying invisible burdens. Emily closed her eyes and drew one slow breath. The first note escaped so quietly that several guests frowned, wondering whether she had begun at all. It floated gently through the enormous chamber like a distant breeze passing through pine trees after fresh snowfall. Another note followed, then another, each one steady, warm, and impossibly pure. The laughter disappeared. Conversation stopped in the middle of unfinished sentences. Even the musicians seated beside the ceremonial platform lowered their instruments without realizing they had done so. Emily continued singing in the old language her mother had carefully preserved, words so ancient that few living wolves still recognized them. Although many guests could not understand the lyrics, they somehow understood the feeling carried inside every phrase. The hymn spoke of mercy before judgment, courage without pride, and a light that remained even after every door had been closed. Several elderly council members exchanged startled looks. One gray-haired priest quietly whispered the forgotten words beneath his breath, astonished that he still remembered them. Near the back of the ballroom, an aging servant wiped unexpected tears from his eyes, unable to explain why memories of his late wife suddenly filled his heart. Madison's smile slowly disappeared. This was not how humiliation was supposed to sound. Derek straightened uneasily, his confidence slipping away with every passing verse. Something invisible seemed to ripple through the grand hall. The silver candle flames no longer flickered wildly, but burned with remarkable stillness, casting soft reflections across polished armor and jeweled crowns. Outside the towering windows, clouds drifted away from the full moon as though answering an ancient invitation. Upon the elevated throne, King Alexander Blackthorn remained perfectly motionless. His council watched him carefully, for they had served beside him many years and knew the king rarely revealed emotion of any kind. Yet his silver eyes had become fixed upon the young Omega standing alone beneath the moonlight. He was no longer seeing a frightened servant surrounded by mockery. He was listening to something that reached beyond memory itself. Deep within him, a place untouched since childhood stirred with quiet recognition. It was not merely the beauty of her voice. It was the impossible familiarity hidden inside every note, as though someone long forgotten had finally found the path home. Emily reached the final line of the ancient hymn and allowed the last note to fade naturally into the stillness. She did not lower her head immediately. Instead, she remained standing beneath the silver moonlight with her hands gently folded before her, waiting for the laughter to return. It never did. The silence filling the royal ballroom no longer felt cruel. It felt watchful, almost reverent, as though the castle itself had paused to remember something buried beneath centuries of forgotten history. Emily slowly opened her eyes. The expression surrounding her had changed in ways she could not understand. Some nobles looked confused. Others appeared deeply unsettled, searching one another's faces for an explanation that none of them possessed. The elderly priest who had quietly recognized fragments of the old language stepped forward by a single pace, his weathered hands trembling ever so slightly. He stared at Emily as if she had spoken with a voice carried from another age. That was not the version taught today, he whispered almost to himself. Those were the original verses. A ripple of uncertainty spread through the royal council. One advisor leaned toward another, speaking so softly that only those closest could hear. Those words disappeared generations ago. No, replied another with a troubled expression. They were never lost. They were sealed. Emily heard none of it. Her attention remained fixed upon the polished marble floor, convinced she had somehow made a terrible mistake. Perhaps she had remembered the melody incorrectly. Perhaps her mother had unknowingly taught her an outdated version that should never have been sung before the court. She opened her mouth to apologize when a quiet sound interrupted every anxious thought inside her mind. It was not a voice. It was the slow, deliberate scrape of a chair moving across polished stone. Every head in the ballroom turned toward the elevated throne. King Alexander Blackthorn had risen to his feet. No royal announcement had been made. No servant had called for attention. Yet the simple act of the Alpha King standing sent a wave of stunned silence through every noble gathered beneath the vaulted ceiling. Those who knew him best exchanged alarmed glances. Throughout years of ceremonies, negotiations, and celebrations, Alexander almost never interrupted royal tradition without reason. Tonight, he had done so without speaking a single word. His silver eyes remained fixed entirely upon Emily. The distance between them seemed to disappear beneath that unwavering gaze. Emily felt something unfamiliar settle inside her chest. It was neither fear nor comfort. It was the strange certainty that the king was listening to something beyond the sound that everyone else had heard. Alexander himself struggled to understand what had happened. Since childhood, his wolf had carried a restless emptiness no healer, priest, or elder had ever explained. It had remained silent through victories, treaties, and countless ceremonies. Yet during the final verses of Emily's hymn, that silence had broken, not with a roar or overwhelming instinct, but with a quiet recognition that settled deep within his soul like the first sunrise after an endless winter. The forgotten melody had awakened memories that did not belong entirely to him. He saw flashes of ancient forests wrapped in silver mist, a queen singing beneath moonlit branches, and a promise spoken long before his own lifetime had begun. They vanished as quickly as they appeared, leaving only one undeniable truth echoing inside his heart. He had heard that voice before, although reason insisted such a thing was impossible. Across the ballroom, Madison's confidence crumbled beneath growing uncertainty. Derek could no longer hide the concern behind his carefully composed expression. Neither of them understood why the most powerful alpha in the kingdom refused to look at anyone except the rejected Omega they had expected everyone to ridicule only moments earlier. No one dared to speak as King Alexander Blackthorne descended the wide obsidian steps leading from the royal throne. His long black ceremonial coat swept lightly across the polished marble, each measured step carrying the quiet authority that had united the northern kingdoms years before. Members of the royal council instinctively stepped aside without being instructed. Even the palace guards, disciplined beyond question, lowered their eyes in silent respect. Emily remained exactly where she stood beneath the moonlight, uncertain whether she should kneel, apologize, or simply disappear before she embarrassed herself further. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears while the enormous ballroom seemed to shrink around the growing silence. Alexander stopped only a few feet away. For the first time that evening, Emily truly saw him. Stories had painted him as distant, unapproachable, almost carved from winter itself. Yet standing before her, his expression held something entirely different. His silver eyes were searching rather than judging, thoughtful rather than cold, as though he had spent years looking for an answer and had unexpectedly found the first piece of it. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched long enough that nervous whispers threatened to return among the gathered nobles. Finally, Alexander asked one quiet question. "Who taught you that hymn?" Emily blinked in surprise. Of every possibility she had imagined, that question had never crossed her mind. "My mother, Your Majesty," she answered softly. She sang it every winter evening. She said it reminded people that kindness survives even when hope feels distant. Alexander remained still. "Did she tell you where she learned it?" Emily slowly shook her head. "She passed away before I was old enough to ask." A shadow crossed the king's face, not of anger, but of reflection. The elderly priest approached carefully, bowing before speaking. "Your Majesty, if I may." Alexander gave the slightest nod. The old priest turned toward Emily with eyes filled more with wonder than suspicion. "Child, the verses you sang have not been heard in this kingdom for more than 60 years. Every royal archive records only the shortened ceremonial version used today. The original hymn vanished after the last silver luna disappeared from history." A murmur spread across the ballroom once again. Noble families exchanged uncertain looks. Several elders quietly recalled stories they had dismissed as bedtime legends. Madison quickly recovered enough confidence to step forward with an elegant smile. "Surely this is only coincidence," she said smoothly. "Old songs often change from family to family. A pleasant voice does not rewrite history." A few guests nodded, grateful for an explanation that restored the comfortable order they understood. Derek folded his arms again, eager to believe the same. Emily lowered her gaze. wishing the attention would end. She had never wanted admiration. She only wanted the uncomfortable moment to pass. Then something unexpected happened. A faint silver glow shimmered across the ancient wolf crest carved into the center of the ballroom floor. It was so soft that many dismissed it as reflected moonlight, yet those closest noticed it immediately. The elderly priest drew a slow breath. "The hallstone," he whispered. "It has not answered a voice since my grandfather was a child." Emily stared at the floor in confusion. She had not moved. She had not spoken another word. The gentle light lingered only a few seconds before fading as quietly as it had appeared. The room fell silent once more, but this silence carried something entirely different. It was no longer the silence of mockery or surprise. It was the silence of people realizing the evening had crossed an invisible line that none of them could explain. Alexander never looked away from Emily. Deep inside, the quiet certainty continued to grow. Whatever destiny had awakened inside the moon-crown ceremony tonight, it had not begun with a performance. It had begun long before either of them had been born. The gentle glow disappeared from the hallstone, yet its memory lingered in every corner of the ballroom. No musician dared resume playing. No servant moved to refill empty glasses. Even the soft crackle of candlelight seemed unusually loud against the silence that had settled over Blackthorn Palace. Emily wished she could quietly return to the edge of the hall and become invisible once again, but the weight of hundreds of curious eyes held her firmly in place. She lowered her gaze, hoping the attention would drift elsewhere, only to notice that the silver embroidery around the ancient wolf crest beneath her feet had become brighter than before. It was faint, almost impossible to see unless someone stood directly above it. Yet it shimmered with the same quiet light that had answered her song moments earlier. Before she could step away, the elderly priest slowly approached the center of the ballroom. His weathered hands trembled as he knelt beside the ancient stone, carefully brushing his fingertips across the engraved symbols that circled the royal crest. His expression changed from curiosity to disbelief. "The silver lines," he whispered. "They have awakened." Several members of the royal council exchanged uneasy glances. One advisor quietly shook his head. "That cannot happen. The hallstone has remained dormant for generations." Another elder spoke with visible uncertainty. "Unless it recognizes something that should not exist anymore." Madison immediately stepped forward, refusing to let the growing mystery shift the attention away from herself. Her confident smile returned, polished and graceful. "Your Majesty," she said with respectful poise, "surely emotions have carried us away this evening." Ancient halls often reflect moonlight in unusual ways. A beautiful performance has inspired imagination, nothing more. A handful of nobles nodded, relieved to hear a practical explanation. They wanted certainty restored. They wanted the evening to return to its carefully planned celebration. Derek also found his voice again. "Emily has always been quiet," he added. "She is kind enough, but there is nothing extraordinary about her. I have known her for years." Emily felt those familiar words settle over her like a heavy winter cloak. Nothing extraordinary. Once, hearing them would have filled her with quiet shame. Tonight, they simply sounded tired, as though they belonged to someone else's story instead of her own. She did not argue. She had never learned to defend herself with clever words. King Alexander listened without interrupting. His eyes never left Emily, studying not her appearance but the calm dignity with which she accepted both praise and doubt. Most people would have eagerly welcomed sudden admiration after years of rejection. Others would have defended themselves against every accusation. Emily did neither. She simply stood with gentle humility, almost apologetic for becoming the center of attention. That quiet grace stirred something unexpected inside the king. Power had surrounded him his entire life. Pride had stood before his throne every season. Yet humility was astonishingly rare. He finally spoke, his calm voice carrying effortlessly across the grand ballroom. "Lady Emily." She looked up immediately. "Yes, Your Majesty?" "When you sang, were you trying to awaken the hallstone?" Confusion crossed her face. "No, Your Majesty. I did not even know it could answer a song." Alexander studied her a moment longer, then gave a thoughtful nod. Her answer came too naturally to be rehearsed. She truly had no idea what had happened. Somewhere deep within the ancient palace, a single ceremonial bell rang once without being touched. Its clear tone echoed through the stone corridors, causing every noble in the ballroom to fall silent again. The elderly priest slowly rose to his feet, his eyes fixed not on the bell tower outside, but on Emily herself. In a voice barely louder than a whisper, he said, "The palace has begun remembering." The echo of the ancient bell lingered through the palace long after its single note had faded, leaving an uneasy stillness behind. No one present could remember the ceremonial bell ringing without the royal bell keeper pulling its heavy rope from the eastern tower. Yet every person in the ballroom had heard it clearly. Emily stood quietly beneath the stained glass ceiling, uncertain whether she should remain where she was or excuse herself before the growing mystery placed even greater attention upon her. She had spent years learning how to become invisible. Standing at the center of the kingdom's most important ceremony felt more uncomfortable than any cruel remark she had ever endured. King Alexander slowly turned toward the elderly priest. "Has this happened before?" The old man lowered his eyes respectfully. "Only once, Your Majesty." According to the oldest royal records, the bell answered when the first silver luna entered this palace nearly 3 centuries ago. The Chronicles describe it as the castle recognizing a voice bound to the ancient covenant. A murmur swept across the gathered nobles once again. Several younger council members looked doubtful, while the oldest among them appeared increasingly troubled. Madison folded her hands gracefully, refusing to surrender the evening without another attempt to reclaim control. "Legends become grander with every generation," she said politely. "Surely no one believes a forgotten servant carries the weight of stories meant for queens." Her words found agreement among a handful of nobles who eagerly nodded. They preferred familiar certainty over impossible wonder. Derek stepped beside her, carefully choosing his words. "Your Majesty, Emily grew up in a modest village. Her family never possessed noble blood or royal education. Whatever happened tonight must have another explanation." Emily listened without resentment. Their opinions no longer pierced her heart the way they once had. Instead, she found herself remembering her mother's quiet smile and gentle reminder that truth never needed to shout in order to remain true. Alexander noticed the remarkable calm with which Emily accepted every doubtful voice. Not once had she interrupted. Not once had she attempted to convince anyone of her worth. That quiet dignity fascinated him far more than the strange events surrounding him. His wolf, silent for so many years, remained unusually peaceful in her presence. It was not excitement. It was recognition, as though something ancient had finally stopped searching. The king stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. "Lady Emily," he said gently, "would you tell me about your mother?" Emily hesitated before answering. "She was kind, Your Majesty. She believed every person deserved compassion, even those who had forgotten how to show it. She never spoke much about herself. She said the past mattered less than the choices we make today." "Did she ever mention the royal family?" Alexander asked. Emily slowly shook her head. "Never. She avoided speaking about old kingdoms or noble houses. She only told me that songs should heal frightened hearts instead of celebrating power." Those simple words settled deeply inside the king. Heal frightened hearts. They sounded strangely familiar, almost identical to a faded sentence he had once read inside an ancient royal journal written by the first Luna of Blackthorn. Before he could speak again, one of the palace attendants hurried respectfully toward the throne platform, carrying a weathered leather scroll case sealed with silver wax. The young attendant bowed deeply before the king. "Your Majesty, the royal archivist requests your immediate attention. He says the Hall of Records has opened a chamber that has remained sealed for generations." Alexander accepted the message without looking away from Emily. Around them, anxious whispers spread through the ballroom once more. Whatever had begun with one forgotten him was no longer confined to a single evening. Somewhere beneath the ancient palace, the kingdom itself appeared to be uncovering memories that time had failed to erase. King Alexander closed the weathered scroll case without breaking eye contact with Emily. The ballroom waited for his decision, yet for the first time in many years, the Alpha King chose not to follow the ceremony exactly as tradition demanded. He handed the sealed case to the captain of his royal guard. "Deliver this to the Hall of Records," he said calmly. "No one is to disturb the chamber until I arrive." The captain bowed and departed immediately, his footsteps disappearing into the long stone corridor beyond the grand doors. The nobles watched in astonishment. Whatever had awakened beneath the palace had become important enough to interrupt the most sacred celebration of the year. Emily remained where she stood, uncertain whether she had somehow caused trouble for the kingdom. She quietly lowered her eyes. "Your Majesty," she said gently, "if my song has created confusion, I am truly sorry." Alexander answered without hesitation. "You have nothing to apologize for." His voice was calm, but every person in the ballroom heard the certainty within it. Emily looked up, surprised by the kindness in his reply. She had expected questions, suspicion, perhaps even blame. Instead, the king regarded her with the same thoughtful expression he had carried since the first note left her lips. Madison could no longer remain silent. "Your Majesty," she said with graceful restraint, "the moon-crown ceremony cannot remain unfinished forever. The noble families have traveled hundreds of miles to witness the choosing of a Luna." Alexander finally turned toward the gathered court. "I am aware." His reply was neither harsh nor dismissive, yet it ended every whisper at once. He continued, "A ceremony meant to honor truth cannot continue while truth itself remains unanswered." Those words settled heavily over the ballroom. Several council members exchanged thoughtful glances. Others slowly nodded. Even those who doubted the strange events unfolding could not deny what they had witnessed with their own eyes. Derek shifted uneasily before stepping forward. "Your Majesty," he began carefully, "Emily is ordinary. I knew her for years. She worked quietly, avoided attention, and never sought recognition." Alexander studied him for a long moment. "Did you ever truly know her?" Derek opened his mouth, but found no immediate answer. The question lingered between them with uncomfortable honesty. He realized that during all the years they had belonged to the same pack, he had never asked Emily about her dreams, her family, or the quiet songs she carried in her heart. He had judged her entirely by what others believed she lacked. Emily noticed the uncertainty on Derek's face and felt no satisfaction. Instead, she experienced an unexpected sadness. How many people had spent their lives overlooking kindness because they were searching only for strength? Across the ballroom, the elderly priest slowly approached a tall stained glass window, depicting the first silver Luna standing beside the founding Alpha King beneath a full moon. He stared at the image before turning back toward Emily. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. The gentle expression painted on the ancient queen's face resembled Emily's quiet smile far more than he wished to admit. It was not identical, but the familiar warmth was impossible to ignore. At that exact moment, pale moonlight streamed through the colored glass, filling the ballroom with soft silver reflections. One narrow beam settled across Emily's shoulders, illuminating her simple ivory dress until it appeared almost luminous against the polished black marble floor. No magic erupted. No dramatic sign announced itself. Yet every person present felt the same unspoken thought. Somehow, the rejected Omega no one had expected to notice had become the very center of a mystery capable of changing the kingdom's oldest story. The moonlight remained upon Emily as though the ancient palace itself had chosen not to let the moment pass unnoticed. She shifted uncomfortably beneath the attention, instinctively taking a small step backward, but the silver light followed her with quiet persistence. A nervous murmur drifted through the ballroom. No one had expected the evening to unfold this way. Noble daughters who had spent years preparing for the moon crown ceremony suddenly found themselves watching an Omega servant become the center of every conversation. Madison's graceful composure finally cracked. "Your Majesty," she said, struggling to keep frustration from her voice, "surely we cannot allow centuries of royal tradition to be overshadowed by coincidence. The ceremony must continue." Alexander turned toward the assembled court, his expression calm but resolute. "It will continue," he replied, "but not until every question placed before this throne receives an honest answer." His words settled like stone across the hall. No one challenged him. No one possessed the authority to do so. Emily quietly clasped her hands together, wishing the polished marble floor could once again hide her from everyone's gaze. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "I never wanted to interrupt this celebration. If returning to the servants' quarters will restore peace, I will gladly leave." Alexander looked directly at her. "If you leave now, every question raised tonight leaves with you." Emily fell silent. She had no answer because she still could not understand why any of this was happening. She had simply sung the only version of the hymn her mother had ever taught her. The elderly priest stepped forward once again. "Your Majesty, with your permission, there is one final tradition we have not observed." Alexander nodded. "Speak." When uncertainty surrounded the old royal court, the priest explained, the Alpha King was permitted to extend the royal cloak of sanctuary. It was never a declaration of rank or destiny. It simply guaranteed that no guest standing beneath the king's protection could be mocked, dismissed, or judged until truth had been revealed. Several older nobles exchanged surprised glances. The custom had not been practiced in decades. Many younger members of the court had never even heard of it. Madison's expression tightened. Derek lowered his eyes, realizing where the conversation was leading. Alexander reached calmly to the silver clasp resting at his shoulder. With one smooth motion, he removed the long black royal cloak embroidered with the ancient blackthorn crest. The rich fabric shimmered softly beneath the moonlight as he stepped toward Emily. She instinctively took a breath, uncertain what he intended. "Your Majesty," she whispered. Alexander gently settled the cloak across her shoulders. It was far too large for her slight frame. Yet its comforting weight felt strangely familiar, like standing beneath the shelter of an ancient oak during a winter storm. The ballroom stood perfectly still. No applause came. No voices interrupted the silence. The gesture itself carried greater meaning than any speech. Alexander looked across the gathered nobles before speaking with quiet authority. "Until the Hall of Records reveals why this night has awakened what history forgot, Lady Emily Carter stands beneath the protection of the crown. No insult, rumor, or judgment against her will be spoken within these walls." Derek slowly lowered his head, not because anyone ordered him to, but because shame settled heavily upon his heart. Madison looked away, unable to hide her disappointment. Emily's eyes filled with quiet emotion, not because she suddenly felt important, but because for the first time in many years, someone with the power to ignore her had instead chosen to protect her dignity. Somewhere beyond the ballroom, another ancient door opened deep beneath Blackthorn Palace, and a faint current of cool air drifted through the corridors, carrying with it the scent of old parchment, cedar wood, and memories that had waited generations to be found. The royal ballroom remained wrapped in quiet wonder as the weight of the blackthorn cloak rested gently across Emily's shoulders. She could still hardly believe it belonged there, even for a single night. Servants who had once hurried past without daring to meet her eyes now looked upon her with quiet respect. Noble families who had dismissed her only an hour earlier stood in thoughtful silence, realizing how quickly certainty could unravel when truth finally stepped into the light. The great doors at the far end of the ballroom slowly opened once more. The royal archivist entered carrying an ancient wooden chest bound with silver bands worn smooth by centuries. Behind him walked two record keepers holding carefully preserved scrolls wrapped in faded blue silk. Every conversation stopped immediately. The archivist knelt before King Alexander Blackthorn and gently lifted the chest onto a carved stone pedestal. "Your Majesty," he said respectfully, the sealed chamber beneath the Hall of Records opened without a key after the ancient bell rang. "We found only one collection inside. Every document bears the crest of the first silver luna." A quiet gasp spread across the court. The archivist carefully unfolded the oldest parchment. Time had faded the ink, but one passage remained remarkably clear. He read aloud in a steady voice. "When the true hymn of the Luna is sung with a heart free from pride, the hallstone shall answer, the palace shall remember, and the crown shall protect the forgotten until the truth stands revealed." Silence settled over every soul in the room. The words described everything they had witnessed that evening. Emily's eyes widened with disbelief. She shook her head gently. "I never knew," she whispered. "My mother never told me any of this." The archivist nodded kindly. "I believe she protected the song until the time was right." Alexander accepted the ancient parchment and read the final lines for himself. Then he looked toward Emily with quiet certainty. He no longer saw an unwanted Omega who had wandered into the wrong ceremony. He saw a woman whose kindness had remained unchanged despite years of rejection, whose voice had awakened memories buried deeper than any royal archive, and whose humility had revealed more strength than titles or noble blood ever could. He stepped forward, stopping beside her beneath the silver moonlight pouring through the stained glass ceiling. "Lady Emily Carter," he said, his voice carrying through every corner of the palace. "This kingdom judged you by what it believed you lacked. Tonight it was reminded to look instead at what you carry within." Emily felt tears gather in her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being seen without shame. She lifted her gaze toward the king. "I never wished to become part of history, Your Majesty." Alexander offered the faintest smile, one so rare that several council members stared in astonishment. "History often begins with those who never seek it." Beyond the palace windows, the full moon shone brightly over the northern forests, bathing the kingdom in quiet silver light. The laughter that had welcomed Emily into the ballroom had vanished, replaced by respect earned not through power, wealth, or rank, but through compassion that never surrendered to bitterness. Long after the guests returned to their homes, they would remember the evening when an overlooked Omega reminded a kingdom that true greatness could not always be recognized by titles, appearances, or expectation. Sometimes it arrived carrying nothing more than a forgotten song, a gentle heart, and the courage to keep singing even when the world expected silence.